Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and survivor of the zombie apocalypse. Welcome to my thoughts on The Walking Dead. With this video, I'll be recapping and discussing the 6th episode of the 9th season titled, Who Are You Now? This is the first official Rickless episode since, spoiler alert, he was not killed from the show, but written out of the show. I actually did like that episode quite a bit. But that wasn't even the craziest thing to happen. The craziest thing to happen was that we jumped ahead. I had guessed 5 years. I believe the showrunners have confirmed that it was a 6-year time jump, which is way bigger time jump than we ever got in the comic book. I believe the comic book time was 2 years, which they did, if you recall, I believe a 1 year time, or maybe they said 5 years and it's 6 years now. But I think there was about a year between. No, it was 6 years, and there was a year between the last episode and this episode. Oh, sorry, a year between the last season and this season, and now it's been 6 years between season five, episode 5, and episode 6. That is a lot of time jump to process, and it feels weird if you're watching just week to week and then trying to think, okay, wait, things that just happened last week to us, it's actually just been 5, 6 years. I don't know why I can get the number right for our characters, which is weird in a lot of ways. But I think this episode shows like the way forward. Like this is what is going to be the new normal for The Walking Dead, which is kind of interesting. So what do we know from the time jump? We know that nobody's died since then. Um, it appears the sanctuary did end up falling based on the events that things were kind of falling apart in the last episode. We weren't quite sure if like all the saviors were on board with that or what's going on, but it sounds like we kind of got the confirmation this week that the sanctuary has fallen, and relations with the hilltop are strained. We did not get any hilltop this week. We got basically everybody else, so that'll be interesting to see like how that relationship actually does work. We see that Carol's hair has grown out. She has settled down with Ezekiel to raise Henry. Henry is now a teenager, which makes sense because he was a kid. So obviously, when you jump 6 years, for adults, the aging is very subtle. But when you have anybody that's under 25, you can see or 20 or 25, you can see that a few years goes a long way. And so glad to see just a completely different actor and take on that. Judith, obviously, we saw last episode. She was the big tease. How we knew it. There was a time jump. We got to see a lot more of. I believe the actress is 11 years old. I'm not sure what age she's supposed to be in the show, but I had guessed about 10 years old, which I think is right. Definitely before like preteen age. We also see that Michonne did in fact have a baby with Rick, who is now a toddler named RJ. And feel free to put down a comment, as I'm not sure where RJ comes from. I don't know what that's names always mean a lot. Like Maggie named her little baby Herschel after her dad. I'm not sure where RJ comes from. Obviously, the R could mean Rick. Michonne had kids before, so maybe there's some kind of naming convention there. I didn't know where it was from. It was really nice to see because we saw that they had talked about making a baby, and then it was we got a montage of her and Rick being together. And you're not sure again how much time has passed. So it's nice that she was in fact able to get pregnant before Rick had passed, and then Rick's legacy does live on, as we are kind of sure that Judith is probably actually Shane's kid, although raised by Rick and Michonne certainly. But it's nice to see that she's got a little one as well. Daryl's become like a mountain man, just living out there in like the swamps of the East Coast. So we don't get to see much of Daryl. He's part of the montage. We do get a montage in the beginning. I'll go ahead and switch to. There we go, because my first slide is of Daryl just taking out a river zombie while fishing. Just snaps that pole in half and just goes right to town. Wearing the poncho. This is a good look for Daryl. I think, increasingly he had been very antagonistic towards everybody, and it's just less and less of a people person and just kind of hating everybody, hating the situation. And for him to just basically turn into full-on mountain man, that's probably fine. Hopefully the the show will figure out a way to actually use him. But he's basically almost not in this actual episode a lot, even though he's in this montage. Aaron has a prosthetic arm to replace the one that he lost in the last episode, which is good. Has kept the full-on bushy beard, which he kind of looks amazing with that. Also, as a kid, apparently, Gracie. That didn't ring any bells for me either. I don't remember Was that a kid they found at some point? God, that does seem familiar. Gracie, somebody's kid. But anyway, so he's adopted some kid that they found at some point. Was that the Savior baby that Rick found that one time when he met the one guy from season one? Ah, that might have been interesting. But that's kind of cool. Heron's got a little adopted kid now. The one thing that I thought was very strange was that the bridge that was the big thing this whole season, and that Rick destroyed in sacrificing himself, sort of, although he didn't end up dying from it, is still destroyed. The montage is we get scenes of Carol and Daryl and Michonne all kind of living their post Rick lives for the last, however many years, and she's just kind of out on her horse, just kind of making the rounds, exploring as she does. And she's talking to Rick the whole time, which she very much talks to Rick still. And she visits the bridge, and it's still a destroyed wreck. It has kind of like a grave marker. That weirded me out because that was like his big thing, was like, we got to put this bridge together, we got to put these people together and come together and make this the symbol of our unity. And the bridge, he had to destroy the bridge in the end. And then also in the end, it turns out, Sanctuary basically fell, the Saviors quit, and then who knows what the relationship with Hilltop actually is, because it sounds like it is strained at best. So, on a kind of depressing note, Rick's plans kind of fell through at the end, like his last big act. Like, yes, he was able to take out Negan and all that, but like, fast forward a year into this season, and like his plans were trying to move forward and bring everybody together, and it just was not happening. And ultimately, even now, 5 years later, not only has it not happened, but they left that bridge a wreck. And I feel like if you're going to make a monument to somebody, you would finish that bridge and name it the Rick Grimes Bridge or something, wouldn't you? So that was kind of weird. I thought that was a little bizarre. But so the theme this week was very much about obviously moving on, and partly from like, especially with Carol and Michonne, we saw a lot of parallels between Carol and Michonne in that they've kind of hung up their fighting ways and turned into being parents and role models and leaders, with some growing pains because this is still the zombie apocalypse. We get 3 point of views this week. We get Carol and Henry, mostly. We get Michonne and the new group that Judith brings in, Magna's group, and then we get Rosita and Eugene. So I'm going to start with Carol, who's sporting some big old hair, kind of witch hair. She's got that like silver, not to disparage women of a certain age who have silvery hair, but you grow that out real big like, and I don't know, you're making a statement, I think. But she looks great. I think Carol is an amazing character. I love the fact that she's gotten together with Ezekiel, because they did establish that in the couple episodes leading into season 9 that they have been an item. The kingdom looks great and prosperous. Everybody's doing so. It's just nice that we have these communities working now. And this is, again, the way forward, is like, it's no longer, we're not in the woods together trying to survive and all that. We have a community to run. There are still some pains. They could use an engineer. They need some certain skills. And Henry has grown up, and I like to see Jerry. Jerry's still around too, which is funny. He's trying to call Carol the queen, and she's not having it. But he needs to learn a skill, like a trained skill. And again, we're kind of seeing the growing pains of a society. It's like, okay, well, how do we train people with skills? Well, you have to apprentice with people that know those skills. Well, the only blacksmith around, or the engineer, really, they call it blacksmith, but so they need an engineer. He's in Hilltop. That's Earl Sutton, who, by the way, is the guy who tried to kill Maggie. Gregory got drunk and got him drunk, and he tried to do all that, and Maggie got him in jail. That was all the episodes earlier in this season. Apparently, he's still doing well, bygones forgiven, and all that. Just a momentary lapse of judgment there. So Carol wants to apprentice Henry at the Hilltop, which means they have to go there. You can't just call an Uber up. You got to get on the horse and the wagon and make the journey. Ezekiel does mention that they are preparing for a fair, which I don't remember if that was a thing in the comic or not, that they had this big event. But I want to say they did. It was around this time too. It was after the time jump. It was this fair. It was a fun way to see like all the characters and how things have gotten all like brighter and nicer. But Ezekiel says like, okay, well, you guys will go. I'll get the fair ready. So they go. They make it, to some town nearby, and they hear a woman scream for help. Now, and I know, this is an obvious ruse. We've seen this a lot of times. If you've ever read any kind of apocalyptic fiction, or just anything that, piece that has anybody on the road, like this is an old hat trick for. I mean, they did this in just every conceivable fiction I can think of. I'm trying to think of a specific situation. I think The Last of Us even did this at one point. Like it's just everywhere. It's a vulnerable character, usually a woman, will cry out for help, and then you're supposed to go, run up there and say, "Oh, how can we help? I'm here," and you got your hero complex going, and all of a sudden everybody pulls guns, and it was a trap. So it's just she's the bait, and there's a trap, and now we're gonna, rob you or whatever. And in this case, it's the saviors from before, and I still can't remember this guy's name. I don't think they ever say it, but it's the guy with the big beard that originally had her at knife point, again, 5 years ago, but for us was like 2 episodes ago, 6 years ago, and had kind of instigated this uprising from the saviors, and they eventually even attacked like Carol's group, and we're not even quite sure how that resolved. Well, it turns out most of them got away. There was that one woman, also with the kind of flat back hair, who was actually the one that had screamed help. So a few of these characters we do recognize as being part of Negan's group that were basically just never able to integrate into our group in general. They just kind of stayed, and apparently, and he's the one that mentioned the fact that Sanctuary did fall, and there's like nowhere to go, and he's like, it's not really my thing. He's got like instead of smoking a cigarette, he's just got a match in his mouth, which turns out to be foreshadowing for a later event, but I don't know why he's rolling with that. And he of course recognized her, and he's just there to rob them. He's like, look, times are tough. We had to eat some of our horses. Like, we're just looking for supplies. We picked you off immediately, and he's actually, it's almost refreshing the fact that they're not super evil, because I feel like in a lot of these post-apocalyptic fictions, you get like, the worst of humanity. People are cannibals and marauding rapists and murderers and just all this awful awfulness to where people are just horrendously horrible to each other. And in this case, they're just like, look, we just need to rob you. And at one point he's like, hey, give me your wedding ring, which, why? Like, at that point you are being a bully. Like, that is really no value to anybody. It's not like you can fence that thing. Everything is food and supply. That's the important shit, and they know it. And of course, that upsets teenage Henry, who gets his stick out Morgan style. Which you notice that he can fight with a stick because Morgan trained him. And he kind of beats the guy a little bit, but there's a bunch of people around, and Carol's like immediately knows to defuse the situation, give up the ring, and then has a little bit of a talk with Henry where he's like, hey, you used to be like a hardcore badass. What happened? And she's just like, you happened. Like, I'm trying to be a parent here and protect you. And it's an interesting philosophy because, Rick kind of went through that too, although Rick kept his badassness because he, in fact, would go even more hardcore in those situations, which I thought was interesting. Like, Rick would absolutely, if they had threatened, the kid at all, he would have fucking snapped. Except when we got to Negan, and then that kind of changed his perspective a little bit, when the chips are really down. So it was interesting, and then that night, we finally switched to the next slide. Carol comes back, douses everyone in gasoline, all of the saviors, and then takes the match out of the guy's mouth. And of course he's freaking out and says like, look, I'll give you the ring back. And she's like, look, it's not about the ring. You've got all this stuff from people that we need, and you've stolen, and things that mean a lot to us. And she basically doesn't say it, but she's like, I still fucking hate your guts, and just lights his ass on fire, just murders so many people there. So that is a statement. Like, yeah, Carol's grown up in some ways, but holy shit, she is also not one to be trifled with, which I liked that combination. I also like the combination that, like, she's very, very still protective of Henry and wants to keep him safe, but also she will not give any fucks. So this was a really, really cool scene that even though she's grown quite a bit, she still has the fire, as it were. I don't know if Ezekiel would approve of that, but that's why you keep Carol around. And then at later that day, and of course Henry just notices the ring and he doesn't really say anything. He's like, all right, well, I guess Mom took care of shit. They do find Daryl on the road, so presumably we'll see more of that next week. Next storyline is our main storyline of the episode. This was Magna's group, which is the one that Judith found in our tease last episode. So it is, if I can find where I wrote down the names, Magna, Luke, Kelly, Nora, and Yumiko. Yumiko is the one who is injured with like a head injury that they have to, Sadiq takes her into the, whatever their ER unit is and heals her. And first of all, it's Aaron and Rosita that come meet with Judith, and they're like, okay, you save these people, but this is not how we do things. Like, and so even all these years have passed, they've still been very kind of isolated in terms of their own group. Like, they still have a security system up. They're not really trying to contact even other groups from what we've seen. You know, they just kind of have their own little area between Alexandria, and really it's just Alexandria and Kingdom right now. We don't know how involved Hilltop is even there. So obviously seeing this group of people apparently is not a very common occurrence, and they did lose somebody. I forgot his Bernie. They lost Bernie, and I think of that fight last episode. We saw that, so they were a slightly bigger group. But not everybody is on board with this group coming in. Judith kind of just puts her foot down and says these people need help. And it's interesting to see, does she have Rick's insight into people? Because I think Rick was always very protective of people, but seemed to generally have a pretty good insight. You know, none of like his group really betrayed him that I can recall. For example, all the people that he's allied with were very good and staunch allies. So if Judith has that quality, that would be very useful to have. And they kind of paper bag everybody, bring them to Alexandria, pull them off, let them inside. But tensions are pretty big, especially when Michonne comes back and is like, "What the hell? We don't just bring people in." But they hold it to a council meeting. And immediately, like Michonne and Magna, who's the woman on the left there, get kind of into a stare-down match. I think I have that slide. Yeah, there we go. And they get to a council meeting and to kind of decide their fate. And I liked seeing this because a lot of what I've been bitching about to the last couple episodes and what could have been solved is the fact that they didn't really have any kind of law or governance system set up. It was just Rick's word, and then kind of Maggie started doing her own thing, and maybe that's why things have started splitting up a little bit, and now Rick, you know, obviously is gone from the picture. Maybe Maggie ran her own set of laws, and now we have finally a set of laws in Alexandria that's an actual like council. Like, fine, that's great. Like, we got to see a little bit of that. They ask kind of questions which are not Rick's classic, like, who have you killed, living or dead, and all those kind of things, and why. Instead, it's like, who were you before? Which is, you know, it's a bit of a job interview question. And then, who are you now? And they're pretty nice. We get some a little bit of insight into everybody. Magna says she was a truck stop waitress. Kind of has that like hard-boiled, you know, defensive demeanor about her. Luke, meanwhile, feels kind of like a Eugene almost, where he's a little bit of a dopey but kind. This was a music teacher, which kind of fits. Kelly, I believe, was the young woman who was just a high school student, which I thought was really, and she had a really poignant moment where she was like, you know, I was a high school kid who was thinking everything was the end of the world until this became the end of the world kind of a thing, which I think everybody kind of nods, you know, at that, like, oh yeah, that's right, we're going to have kids that are basically like growing up in the zombie apocalypse now. Not just Judith, but those, you know, like Carl, like that made it like halfway through childhood, and then this just fucked everything up from there. And Nora's a deaf woman, which you never see on television, and they really kind of went heavy into that. They leaned into it with the fact that Kelly had to translate for a lot of it, and she was doing like actual sign, as far as I know, actual American Sign Language, which was really cool to see. I thought that was really neat. I actually watch with subtitles. I pretty much watch subtitles on everything regardless. A lot of times when I'm watching, I'm doing other things, or I watch a lot of TV like Netflix while I'm working out and that kind of thing. So having subtitles on all the time is normal for me. But when I saw the sign language and everything, I was like, oh crap, they're actually doing that. That's really nifty. To where a lot of times it was like, you know, the other character had to even translate parts of it, and then at the end, like Judith's even trying to do some of it. So I liked seeing that. That was really fun to see, and it makes the group feel really authentic. Obviously, Walking Dead has always been very good about diversity and inclusion when it comes to just the full spectrum of different kinds of backgrounds and sexual orientations and all these different things. So that's always been a big strength of the show, and Magnus Group obviously reflects that pretty well. What are my notes? Yeah, the group feels appropriately emotional and real. Michonne finds a prison tattoo, however. Magna has wrapped her hand up and finds a prison tattoo on there, meaning that she was a prisoner at some point. A hardcore time, too, where they had the like serious tattoo. And she also finds the fact that she had a knife on her, which this seemed pretty irresponsible. Like, Michonne frisks her, and again, Michonne's got the insight of almost the opposite, where she like looks at Magna and like instantly distrusts her and frisks her and says, oh, you frisked her? And then she lets her go, and then when they do the council meeting, it's then that Michonne is like, you need to now give up your blade that I'm going to prove in front of everybody. It's like, okay, that made for a nice dramatic scene, but also, you should have probably pulled that out when you frisked her, unless she was really just, you know, guessing and had a good guess there. It was like a belt buckle blade, which was crazy. And it turns out Magna also had another blade on her, and Yumiko's necklace also turned into like a butterfly knife or something crazy, which was a really good idea for a piece of jewelry to double as a weapon, as most people wouldn't probably deprive you of jewelry like that. I'm not sure how Magna ended up with it. I guess she just grabbed it from her, or had it for some reason, which Magna will eventually give up later. But Michonne is basically very, she says like I'll second whatever motion, and just kind of very flippant and defensive over the whole thing. And we can see that Michonne is really, she's become a good mom to Judith and RJ, but she's still very much dealing with her shit. I mean, it has been 6 years since Rick's death, and she's still talking to Rick, like talking to him, like how Rick talked to Lori on the phone, which was in the comic and in the show. But again, that was like right after that happened, and only lasted for like what, like a week of time, and we all thought that Rick was going crazy because of it. And Michonne, this is 6 years later, and she is like openly talking to Rick. Now you could argue the fact that, well, like, people sit there and pray and do all that, and I would have, I'd say like, yeah, that's fine, but it felt like this was a real conversation that she was having. So clearly Michonne is working through some issues, but I did like the focus on Michonne in particular in this episode. It gave her a lot to do, made her an even more complex character, because again, she's head of security here. She's trying to be a parent, a protective parent, kind of like Carol, and in doing so, she ends up being really like defensive of outsiders. For good reason, especially when she notices like, hey, this one has a prison tattoo. We don't know anything about them. She has a blade that they lied about. So we don't see the council vote, but it sounds like, what we infer later is that they will kick them out as soon as, and I think the group actually says that as soon as Yumiko is healed up, then they have to leave. Well, then we get some scenes with, what is my next slide? Okay, we can see Judith. We do get some scenes where Judith actually kind of convinces Michonne that like, hey, well, this is what Rick would do. Rick would let people in, to an extent. And she has a fun scene with Negan, especially, where she's like doing homework about airplanes, and Negan's like, nobody's gonna fucking see an airplane again. This is useless. And Negan has a fun little line about, he used to bring stray dogs. And by the way, Negan, shaved and looking pretty good, he's still imprisoned. Which, if we count that year between the seasons, he's been imprisoned for 7 years. That's a long time. I mean, yeah, he had a life sentence, but they stuck to their guns on that, and he's still around. He's survived and still doing it. So maybe he's found some peace as well. And I mentioned last week that I was weirded out by the fact that Rick would leave the show and Negan wouldn't, because that was such an interesting dynamic in the comic going forward. Was like Rick and Negan had this really complex, interesting relationship moving forward. And now maybe Judith will take the place of that. I have mixed feelings about that. I still love seeing Jeffrey Dean Morgan here. It just feels weird to see him without Rick to play off of. But with Judith, they have an interesting little play-by-play, and he talks about how he used to bring stray dogs in until one of the dogs bit the other dogs and his mom, and then, alluding to the fact that, like, you have to be able to, you have to have some kind of screening process, the whole thing about immigration we could go into. But Judith is like, well, yeah, that really worked out for you, being in jail, so she got kind of the last word in terms of what his philosophies ended up bringing him. So I think, it's a complex argument. There's good room for debate there, as long as it doesn't come from, any kind of racist standpoint. I won't go into our current political affairs here, but I liked seeing a big focus on Judith, obviously wearing the hat, having the gun. I liked seeing Negan, and I liked seeing Michonne with a lot of layers going on. And at one point, Magna just goes to Michonne's house, and at first it's kind of like almost with a dangerous overtone, because she's got the blade, and you're thinking, okay, she's going to attack Michonne, which isn't really going to do any good for their team other than get them all killed. But I don't think that was the plan. I think her plan was to give up the blade or talk to Michonne in some way, and then she sees, Michonne having RJ in there, and like, oh, okay, this person is also more, complicated than I thought, and so they have a nice little exchange together where Michonne basically just kind of admits, like, yeah, who we were in the past is important, but it's who you are now that's the most important. People can change a little bit, and certainly zombie apocalypse can definitely change them, so you might be a hard-ass person, but probably you aren't evil. Now, maybe a good conversation would have been like, why were you in jail at some point? I would have liked to hear that, and maybe that's still coming. But the compromise they reach is that as soon as Yumiko is healed, which turns out that happens that next morning, and she jokes about the fact that, well, if we had been kicked out, I would have, stayed injured longer. Michonne offers to bring them to the hilltop, and maybe Maggie will have a place for them. So this kind of put me as a strange, because it's like, okay, well, you don't want to have them around because you don't quite trust them, and so you're going to bring them to the hilltop, and you think Maggie is more open to having strangers in there? Not the Maggie I know. And again, it sounded like relationships were strained to where everybody was like, you're going to hilltop? Like, so I don't know, it seems weird. to bring them all there, but it is an excuse for us to see Hilltop because we didn't get an omnipotent view of Hilltop like we did Alexandria and the Kingdom this time. They are still a question mark in what they look like 6 years later, so that'll be a good excuse for, I believe it's Michonne and Sadiq, because they still, I guess, want to look after Yumiko on the road to Hilltop. The other story that we get is Rosita and Eugene, although first we've got Father Gabe and Rosita are a thing, which Father Gabe must have some serious game, because the last time we saw him, the last story arc involved a woman that he had relations with. So apparently Rosita and Gabe have hooked up, which Eugene still pines for Rosita, which is just weird at this point. Eugene wants to amplify his radio. He still wants to find people and bring people in, which is definitely the opposite of how Michonne and I think a lot of the other people feel, is we're like, hey, we've got enough people. We're good. We don't trust people. And Rosita offers to just go to a high tower, I think it's a water tower, with Eugene, because Eugene's still the techie, which Eugene's sporting a nice new haircut, but he's still kind of a weirdo. They go up the water tower, but a herd comes while Eugene is up there. And so they have to run. Eugene falls the last little bit because his ladder falls and he ends up twisting his knee, and there's a big crutch. There's this whole drama with a herd coming. It's okay, we have to have this drama. They manage to get down into just a muddy area, and they cover themselves with mud, like as if they're being hunted by a predator. Which we've seen the gormaflage work. We haven't seen mud work. Zombies don't really sense infrared, but we know that the smell can fuck them. I don't know. It just feels weird that the mud could fuck them up like that. But anyway, it does. Zombies don't see them. They still walk with their herd. And then we hear the whispers. The whispers! Literally the whisperers. So Rosita and Eugene are hiding, and they're like, where are they? Really, really cool walker whispers. And of course, they freak out and think, oh god, the walkers are talking now, which... this isn't like, what was that last, I think it was Land of the Dead, where they did have, zombies using weapons or something weirdness. Spoiler alert for the comics, these are not evolved zombies. These are a group of people called the Whisperers who wear, basically gormaflage. In fact, I think they literally wear, Leatherface zombie masks and just shuffle along with the zombies. Essentially have learned to adapt to the zombies rather than, wall themselves off and remain humans. They walk along with the zombies and just kind of dress up like them, and then they can kind of talk to each other using that weird whisper voice talk, and that's how they get by. And it's a very weird thing, and that's what we are looks like we're getting to, which I believe does line up correctly with the comic in terms of also introducing Magna's group. Happened about the same time as the Time Jump and the Whisperer. So interestingly enough, as much as the show has departed from the comic in terms of we no longer have Rick or Carl around, and obviously Carol died long ago in the comic, and Andrea was still a thing in the comic. Andrea and Rick are the ones that become an item in the comic. They just replaced Andrea with Michonne straight up here in the last couple of years. But now they're starting to be, as different as it is, obviously without Rick and Carl, it's a huge difference. But we're doing the Whisperers, we're doing a Time Jump, we've got Magna's group, so maybe we're still, we're not quite spinning off on our own thing. We're still using the comic as a baseline, which I think is really interesting. We do not see, in this episode, we don't see Maggie, Jesus, or Enid, as they are all Hilltop people. The very few people associated with the Hilltop. I mean, almost everybody's in Alexandria, and then we just have, I think, Carol and Ezekiel. I guess Henry's now a character at the Kingdom, and then Maggie, Jesus, and Enid were at the Hilltop. We also, and we don't see any of Hilltop. We also don't see any of Tara at all, and I'm not sure I guess she joined Hilltop. We don't see any of the Oceanside people either. Maybe either they joined Hilltop or they left. We don't see Alden, who is the dude I had to look his name up, as the pretty boy savior. And I remember in the last episode they mentioned that that one evil guy who got killed this episode by Carol, burned, had mentioned the fact that he had taken those guns off of him because he was the one sent after them. So did he die off screen, or is it just, did he get written off the show? We don't know anything about him. So he is like a barely kind of side character who still had, I couldn't remember his name for the longest time, but that's kind of interesting to see where we are with that. So we didn't quite see everybody, but we saw a bunch, and no doubt we will see more of Hilltop probably next week because we are headed there with Maggie and Sadiq and Magna's group, and then Carol and Henry and now Daryl are headed to the Hilltop, so we could see a big convergence there. So winners from this episode. Carol is a winner. She's got the long hair, but she's still hard as hell. She's a cool wife to Ezekiel. She's a cool mom to Henry. But she still gets shit done. We got to weirdly wrap up a dangling plot thread, even though it technically took event. Again, that was the weirdest thing. Like, for us, that just happened last week, where he attacked and was a big asshole and everything. But for them, it's been 6 years that she's last seen this guy. And so, like, it makes sense for us that she would do this from a grudge standpoint. But for her to go 6 years later and then be like, oh, no, I'm going to burn you all alive. Wow, that's pretty hardcore. But I put her in the winner column because I liked it. Judith is a winner. I think she's got the heroism and decision-making of Rick, and possibly even his insight into people. And even clearly, Michonne listens to her as well. There's a really heartbreaking moment where she confides to Michonne. She's like, I'm trying to hear their voices, and they're being Rick and Carl's, but I can't. They're fading, like, every day. And that's heartbreaking because also, with their level of technology, you know, they don't have, you know, videos and archival footage of any kind, even audio tapes. Like, it's just, if you, and the voice especially, like, you, and their images, like, you can just, you forget, and that's really terrifying. And especially for, you know, she'd only had like 6 years with him or something, if that. So was really, really depressing to hear that, and just kind of heartbreaking. But otherwise, I do think she's a great character. That actress is going to be really solid, and I think her anchoring the show will be pretty good going forward. Winner, Michonne. Also, we got a huge focus on Michonne taking the spotlight, which is great because she has not had much to do really the last couple of years. Ever since she kind of hooked up with Rick, it's just been more about just their relationship together. And that was her whole plot arc, was just, it's you and me now, Rick, which, you know, that is kind of what Andrea turned into in the comics as well. But in the comics, we never lost Rick. So what does Michonne do afterwards? Well, she still pines and talks to Rick all the time, but now she's becoming her own person. You know, she's head of security at Alexandria, and she's very protective of her own kids, but still goes out and does the adventuring thing, and was like finding, you know, that little sheriff toy that reminded her of Rick, and still exploring. So just doing a whole lot, and it's nice to see her doing that. Losers, Henry. Sorry, man, you made the wrong call. You're young, impressionable, idealistic, and those are all problems in the zombie apocalypse. As opposed to, you know, Judith, who maybe has some of those qualities but seems a lot more self-assured and resourceful. And I almost feel bad because Carol should have taught him better, right? Like, Carol, more than anybody, knows to be cautious and smart about situations. And I feel like she may be, you know, hung up her proverbial sword a little too much. You know, remember when she was used to, like, teach kids how to shoot and wanted to, you know, back in the prison section, and now it's like he doesn't, I mean, I don't know. It just seems like such an obvious ruse to not fall for the, you know, random woman screaming for help. And maybe that just speaks to Henry's personality. He's got a lot of that kind of hero complex going, but putting him in the losers column for that. Also, Eugene goes in the losers column, not necessarily for like falling and hurting his knee or anything like that, but for still pining for Rosita all these years later. Dude, it's just weird now. And in fact, at one point he's like, look, I gotta tell you something I've always felt about, and she's just like, fucking don't make this weird, man. You're like, Rosita has so moved past this. She's got a whole nother relationship with Gabriel now. Eugene, just stop, man. You've come a long way since you were Negan's buddy, and then you betrayed Negan and helped win the day, and now you're still, after all these years, just pining for Rosita. It's just fucking weird. Ironically, in the comics, they do get together. But I believe even then it's like a tenuous relationship. But I think they do actually hook up in the comics at some point. But I don't think that's the idea here. Just stop, Eugene. All right, that will do it for my thoughts on the 6th episode of The Walking Dead Season 9. If you like my content, please consider supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. I'll see you next time with more Walking Dead thoughts.